And I think we're good now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for your patience with us as we, got this webinar started and worked through any technical bugs that we were having. I want to say Happy Fair Housing Month to everyone. Um, and thank you for joining our panel. So, the 1968 Fair Housing Act was born out of a time of crisis, and today we find ourselves in another. As federal protections are rolled back, we are learning that we can't just leave equity up to being a federal mandate. It must be a promise that Connecticut is willing to fulfill. Our panel today, Sustaining the Soul of Fair Housing, is about highlighting what is happening to protect our Connecticut residents. We're exploring how our own state statutes and local initiatives can serve as our roadmap when the federal government turns away from key fair housing frameworks such as disparate impact and the AFFH rule. We're privileged to have the leadership of Michelle Dumas-Kuehler from the CHRO, Greg Kirschner from the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and Erin Boggs from OCA, three organizations that prove unity is our greatest resource in a climate of scarcity. Guiding us through these complexities is Professor Nadia Humber. Nadia is not only an associate professor of law at UConn, but a dedicated advocate who has spent her career representing those in housing court and researching how technology can either bridge or widen the equity gap. Please join me in welcoming Professor Humber.
Thank you so much, Rashida, for your warm opening remarks and very kind introduction. So I'd really like to begin by formally introducing our three panelists, after which I will open with questions. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Erin Boggs. Erin is the founding executive director of Open Communities Alliance, a Connecticut-based civil rights organization dedicated to confronting residential segregation and its consequences. Erin has been a leading force in Connecticut's housing reform movement, playing a central role in advancing zoning reform proposals that served as a conceptual foundation for the state's landmark 2025 housing legislation. Our next speaker is Michelle Dumas-Kuehler. Michelle is the managing director of the Housing, Training, and Appeals Divisions of the Legal Division and Commission Counsel for the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Mouthful. In that role, Michelle represents the agency in the prosecution of employment, housing, and public accommodation discrimination cases before human rights referees, as well as in state and federal court. Finally, our next guest speaker is Greg Kirschner. Greg is the executive director and legal director of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, whose core mission is to ensure that all people in Connecticut have equal access to housing opportunities free from discrimination. At the center, Greg leads the litigation and prosecution of fair housing cases before administrative agencies and in state and federal courts. So again, thank you to our three speakers for being here today. And I'm just going to dive right in because we want to hear from you. So before we look forward, let's look back just for a moment. I invite all three of you to respond to my first question. So looking back at the 1968 Fair Housing Act, it was born out of a moment of national crisis. How is the current federal hostility actually a catalyst for Connecticut to create a more robust civil rights framework than we ever had under federal guidance? Um, Thoughts from each of you?
I'm happy to take the first run at this. The rollback of civil rights at the federal level has made what happens in Connecticut's legislature and in our courts and among our state agencies all the more important. And also, I hope will be a springboard for making what we have here as the infrastructure for fair housing all the stronger. And we are certainly excited about in upcoming years working together to make some of those changes happen, whether it be something as simple as joining the majority of states that allow one-way recording of phone calls so that you can do fair housing testing, to making sure that subsidized housing is balanced throughout the state, to having meaningful zoning reform. All of these things are things we can do together. And I think part of what we can also ask ourselves is, starting on day one of a new federal administration, what's our plan? Are we going to have that together, and are we going to be ready to run with that as soon as we possibly can?
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin.
I'll add on to that. I think in Connecticut, I've always felt this way. We're pretty lucky in that we have a very robust Fair Housing Act with lots and lots of protected classes, which the federal government does not have. And so I always like to remind people that in these times, because we've been in these times before, and they're scary, that your legislators and the people in your community felt strongly and well enough to lobby your legislators to make sure that we have all of these extra protected classes. And when this happened, I always let people know from the rooftops, we are open. We are open in ways that if the federal government is closed, the state government is open. And our process is here and available. And it is much more encompassing than the federal government is. And so all of that gives me hope. And with our partners here on the Connecticut Fair Housing side and Erin at Open Communities, and we all emanated from the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. It's the spawn of all that is great in the state of Connecticut. We are really always here having folks back and making sure that we, in the ways that we do, will represent the interests of folks, and making sure that we always push the boundaries as much as we can. I do want to say, Erin, I'm going to take you up on your question. I think one of the things that's very important to do, if the next administration is amenable to it, is we need to codify sexual orientation and gender identity into statute. It is in statute here in Connecticut, but it is not federally. It is an interpretation of a Supreme Court case. So if I had my druthers, I would want to restore a lot of the guidance and get that into solid form. And also I'd want to make sure that those protected classes, along with source of income, are added to our federal statute.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle.
I
Greg?
think it's a really interesting time that reminds us that things like the Fair Housing Act speak to civil rights. And really, I think at the core of it, we're all very invested in this because it entails human or natural rights. And it really brings into stark relief the fact that it's a precarious thing to rely on statutes and law to try to provide equality and try to provide a just society. And so while we need to continue fighting using the tools that we have and making sure that people's rights and opportunities are respected, I think it speaks to the bigger question of societal change that we really need to embrace. I'm a big proponent of the Fair Housing Act, obviously, but we have had it now for, many decades, more than 50 years, and it's still a struggle to ensure that people are treated fairly. So what we really need to redouble or perhaps start our earnest efforts to create systems that are just more equitable and fair in their nature, as opposed to trying to graft civil rights onto really broken relationships and broken systems. So I've come to think of our mandate and the fair housing mandate of being broader, although a lot of our work is focused on vindicating the rights of individuals, but being broader and really looking at affordable housing, social housing. We need to return to a time when, excuse me, people could rely on the government to provide them adequate, decent housing that would set them up well for life and not just be thrown into a marketplace that too often is exploitive. There's no reason in 2026 that there should be horrible living conditions impacting thousands and thousands of people across our state and largely concentrated among people of color in our state. So, issues like getting back to a form of social or public housing that's really available and, really provides a strong foundation for a good life, I think is something that we need to embrace. I think that, going sort of beyond our narrow book of work, ensuring that the state is adequately funded and they adequately fund social services and adequately fund education, because we're not going to break the cycle of people being more vulnerable to exploitation if we don't arm people to be able to defend themselves, excuse me, and develop the best life that they can. So, while it's right to focus on the fact that we are lucky to be in Connecticut in so many ways, and in particular with the civil rights protections that are available and that will continue to be vigorously enforced by all the agencies represented on this call, I think we really have to take this opportunity to look at ourselves, look internally, think about how we got here, think about where we want to go, and think about what systems we should create to replace the ones that we have that have been broken for a very long time, gave us the conditions that required the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and continue to reverberate till today.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really think that's a really great segue to my next question. Just thinking about your organizations and the roles that your organizations play in these systems, right? And sort of thinking about it in a more forward way. So I invite all three of you to respond to this as well. So we often see your organizations working on different pieces of the puzzle: legal enforcement, policy advocacy, and state regulation. And so your thoughts on this, in this adversarial era, do you think the line between your separate missions have blurred? How have they blurred, or how haven't they? What are your thoughts on that, given what Greg just shared? Who'd
I
like
can,
to who'd
I
like to start?
can, I can,
Aaron?
I can jump in. And I think that one thing that is great is that we all work together, and there are different focuses for the different organizations. As Greg said, like they are very focused on doing, direct representation with clients, but their cases also end up having impact, our impact litigation. So like they're flowing into that. And they've got some amazing cases that have shaped the landscape here in Connecticut. OCA does also individual representation, but at a smaller scale. And we're really trying to focus our time on that impact litigation part of the puzzle, along with the policy change. But there's flows into what the Fair Housing Center is doing too. We work together, and we manage to sort of cover all of I think many of the important parts of fair housing representation in a cooperative way. So I think it ends up working very well. And there are so many challenges when it comes to housing discrimination and policies that segregate and disinvestment from communities of color that fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot to do, and we have some strong organizations here to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. Shell, Greg, would you like to respond?
I will jump in. So I do agree that there's probably a little bit more overlap in the last several years. I think Aaron, your Open Communities has done a great job of really trying to reach out to all of the players and all of those who are interested on many levels, not just on the fair housing side, but really just on all sorts of community need. And Greg mentions it with affordable housing. I couldn't agree more. I don't think, and I know that housing discrimination wouldn't disappear if there were more housing or more affordable housing, but I do think it would go a long way in kind of alleviating the absolute strain that we have on housing right now. We all work together. So at the commission, we do not do direct client representation. We have cases that people file, and we represent the state because there's been a violation of our statute. And so that's why we come in to prosecute and protect our statutes on an individual basis of the actual complainant. But I think we're really trying to push, with the help of the Fair Housing Center and with Open Communities, where we see on a more global level the needs of the people who live here in the state. And we are going to do that through open communities with working on legislation and through the Fair Housing Center, who we often partner with on litigation. They're representing the folks who have filed complaints with us. We do legislative work of our own. We do a lot of education and outreach, which I know all of these organizations do, because we can't really even begin to talk about any of this if the people who live here and the people who own the housing don't know that the laws exist. We don't want this to be some sort of a gotcha moment. And I would like to believe in my naive world, I guess, sometimes that people just don't know. And so they don't make the right choices. But we need to really do a good job with the education piece of it, which I think we lend to that. We really want to make sure that people know what their rights are so they exercise their rights. It's really scary sometimes, and we want to try to make this process easy and not scary, because in the end, by bringing cases, by reaching out to your legislators, by letting us know what's happening on the ground, that's how we can all work together and do work together to try to effectuate change. But it's hard. I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's hard. The needle moves ever so slowly, and sometimes it falls backwards a little bit. So anyway.
Thank you.
I think we have a good history of trying to be additive to each other. I think Michelle mentioned the education and outreach. We reach 7 or 8 thousand people a year with our education and outreach. I can't remember 3.5 million people in Connecticut, so obviously there's limitations to how far we can go. I know that CHRO provides a regular training opportunity for landlords that we refer landlords to, because we just don't have the time to address, every preventative education opportunity that may exist. So we're grateful for that. OCA has, really forwarded coordination among organizations and individuals who have interests in housing and housing equity through Growing Together Connecticut, and we all come together in that and work on issues and policies that we hope will improve the landscape. So, as I think Aaron said, there's just so many different aspects of the work. It's difficult in a world of constrained resources for anyone to be able to address all of them. So I think we all have kind of carved out our areas where we are most impactful. And I don't want to speak for Michelle, but I imagine that they have the same kind of burden that we do. We get 3,000 calls a year, and just being responsive to the people who are contacting us, could take up almost all of our resources. So where we can carve out areas that we can focus on and really be additive to the work that other people are doing, whether it's other folks on this call or other great organizations and individuals around the state. That's really important, because otherwise, we just do a poor job on things that we're trying to just touch and not really be able to invest in. So coordination is key. Organizing is key. We're all in this together. We all need to be there for each other.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Greg. And we're going to return to some of the ways and question you about the ways that you plan to work together a little bit later in the program. But for now, I actually would like to direct some of the next few questions to you directly. And Erin, I'd like to begin with you just to get your perspective, your organization's perspective on this question. So my question for you is, the repeal of the 2021 AFFH rule removes the zoning tax in the eyes of the federal government, but in reality, we know that it removes a roadmap for equity. So how do you think Connecticut's HB 802 or 8002, the housing growth plans, acting as our own local version of AFFH, excuse me. So just to reiterate, how is Connecticut's HB 8002 acting as our own local version of AFFH? So to say that a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And to sort of step back for a minute, I think probably most people are here today because they care about fair housing and therefore probably have a sense of the history behind it and the extent to which government at all level played a very um, active role in creating the kind of segregation that we have today. And the Fair Housing Act includes a section that actually still exists no matter what the Trump administration is doing with regulations that says recipients of federal certain federal monies have to, on purpose, try to reverse that history of intentional segregation. And the way that this effort would ideally work and was, evolving into under prior administrations is that municipalities in the state of Connecticut would have to actually do the planning and, where appropriate, zoning to create, allow for diversity. And that's particularly something that comes down to having affordable housing available due to income and wealth racial gaps. And so the new law, the section of the new law called the Housing Growth Plan section, basically does that, if it's implemented correctly. And what it functionally does is it says to almost every town in Connecticut, except those that are have the lowest per capita mill rate, per capita, tax income, is all of the other towns need to do a plan and create zoning that allows for a fair portion of the need for affordable housing in their region. And so there's a lot more that needs to be added on to that in terms of nuance, making sure that families with kids are part of that, making sure that housing is accessible, making, all of these various pieces of the Fair Housing Act. There's a way to address that within this bill or in this new law. But the bottom line is we've been able to pass something in Connecticut, not perfect, but something here in Connecticut that at least starts us on the road to this concept that every town needs to be playing a role in taking steps to intentionally undo this legacy.
Wonderful. Thank you for responding, and just giving us a sense of, how our state is reacting to some of the federal policies. And in that similar light, there are some other policies that we want to talk about that the federal government is attempting to roll back, even though it's the law. So, Greg, my next question is for you. So, if the federal government is no longer interested in disparate impact, how do we use Connecticut's own state statutes to prove that neutral policies are still causing discriminatory outcomes? So essentially, right, how do Connecticut courts look at disparate impact? How have they looked at it in the past? We'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Just as a quick primer for people, disparate impact talks about a neutral policy that may not be necessarily intended to target people based on their protected class status, but does have the effect of excluding them. So, for example, one that we've litigated many times is an occupancy limit on how many people can live in an apartment that would limit that have a disproportionate impact on families with children because they tend to have larger households than families that don't have children or households that don't have children. So, I guess I'd preface this as saying that the law is still the law. Disparate impact still exists. It's still recognized under the Federal Fair Housing Act, and we will continue to enforce it in federal court, at least at present, unless something else should drastically change. But disparate impact is also part of the State Fair Housing Act, which largely follows the Federal Fair Housing Act with some minor deviations and then some significant deviations with protected class status, where Connecticut protects more people. The Connecticut courts, while acknowledging disparate impact as an avenue to prove discrimination under the State Fair Housing Act, have essentially not opined on it or have not confronted the issue in any decisions that I'm aware of. So the Connecticut Supreme Court has said that disparate impact can be a way to show discrimination and has laid out a test for it, basically based on the then federal standard by the Second Circuit. So it's a little unknown exactly what tests the state would use at this point for a disparate impact case, if they would stick with that or if they'd look to the current federal courts guidance on how to establish disparate impact. But we're very confident that the courts would recognize that and would enforce it under the state law. if we need to go that route, or we do need to go that route if it involves a protected class that's not protected at the federal level. Source of income, sexual orientation, veteran status, domestic violence status. I'm probably missing something, but the additional protected classes in the state.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. And so, again, in a similar light, we would love to hear more from Michelle, and from your agency perspective about some of these rollbacks as well. So, question for you, given that federal policies can really shift in every new administration, what specific legal firewalls has Connecticut built to ensure that our residents' rights remain protected despite what may happen in DC?
That's a good question, and I think I've been in fair housing for a long time and have been through many administrations, and there are nuances to every administration that comes through. They're not this, but there certainly are some priorities that different administrations have when it comes to fair housing, and just by virtue of who they appoint as the head of HUD. I've been at the commission for 21 years, and I can say that our leadership has always been very strong in that we have a statute. We are going to enforce that statute. We are thankfully, we get a lot of funding from the state government itself. And so that firewall is just really been at the bottom line firewall, which is the money that we receive to do the work that we do. Isn't the bulk of it's not coming from the federal government. Now, listen, we need that money and we want that money and we desperately use that money, but we're not similar to some other commissions that are in the New England states that really rely heavily on their federal money in order for them to exist and for them to do the work that we do. We've been very fortunate that this state has made the discrimination enforcement of our statutes a priority. And so our budget is not solely tied to the federal government's money. I think, just as I said earlier, as an administration and as an agency, we've always been very strong with what the folks here in Connecticut need. And our statutes are very inclusive of that. It's why almost every year a new protected class gets added to our statute, why we have the Crown Act, which protects hairstyle. We are one of very few states who has that. We have very expansive protections as it relates to pregnancy discrimination. And we have menopause, up this session. Hopefully it'll pass. We really are addressing that. And we operate as this just state unit that doesn't flow so much in directions based on who's in the administration. We've been very fortunate with that. I mean, I started working here when John Rowland was the governor, and there was never an issue with us existing. I think, thankfully, we are the land of steady habits, and thankfully, steady habits seems to be enforcing the fair housing laws and all of the discrimination laws here in Connecticut, which I very much appreciate. So I think what's really challenging is making sure that people recognize, again, that we are open. It can be really daunting what is happening federally. It can really be heavy, and it can really, really get people to a place where they just can't even exercise their rights because they just feel it's not going to come to any good end. But that's not true, because we have my agency and the great folks who work there, and we have a dedicated housing unit. That's all they do, is they investigate housing discrimination complaints. And so I think we've been able to weather the federal storms. There's been storms, but for now, we've been able to weather them.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in with a couple
Sure.
of additional points. One, I was going to just emphasize the fact that the state of Connecticut has historically made a commitment to this. I believe CHRO is the longest existing.
We are the oldest state-based civil rights organization in the entire United States, 1943.
You've become a steady habit. So there you go.
Yes. Cheryl will be very happy. She likes to talk about that because it's true. I mean, we've been very much committed to, actually, Richard Rothstein, who just shout out to Richard Rothstein, was looking for some of our early research. The commission started as a research commission to research race discrimination and the impact of that, and then realized shortly thereafter that we needed much more than that. So,
And I think that CHRO deserves more resources, but the fact that the state of Connecticut does provide resources and ensures its functioning regardless of what's happening in Washington is super important. And so, we should acknowledge and recognize that as well.
mhm.
So, I do think that that is an essential firewall. One of the interesting things about the Federal Fair Housing Act is that even in the best of times, it's a largely delegated process. So it's fascinating that the Fair Housing Act, pronounces in its first section that it's the policy of the United States to ensure fair housing is to the limits of the Constitution across the country. And then when you get into the act, you're like, so any of you who are victimized by housing discrimination, you've got to enforce it and go to court. And then
Oh yeah,
you
yeah,
can complain to HUD, but we're probably going to send it to your state to investigate. So
right.
there's already this delegation of responsibilities under the act that exists even in the best of times. And again, CHRO, I don't know exactly the staffing, but we have dedicated housing investigators for our
Mhm.
state that probably, even in good times, exceeded the numbers of HUD investigators for the entire region of New England.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So, folks in Connecticut are lucky to have these resources available to get more timely attention and action on what's going to happen. And we're lucky. Um, we're proud to be able to provide the services to folks to make it more accessible for them to file complaints and to bring cases and to be what the statute envisions as private attorneys general. You all have to be your own attorney general and enforce the Fair Housing Act on behalf of the federal government. It's hard to do without organizations like ours and OCA. So I think, we do fill an important role in that way in bridging that access to courts or to the CHRO.
Well, and just to sort of follow on to that, these points are all the more important because HUD fair housing staff has been decimated. They have been cut. Last figure I heard was 70% of the staff gone. And so getting any of this work done through a federal channel is going to be difficult to impossible, not even mentioning the shift in priorities, in terms of what they're going to cover. So these resources here in the state are all the more important.
Mhm.
Such a great point. Thank you all for just, chiming into that last question and, speaking to when times are good, right? Unity is easy when times are good.
Mhm.
But to your point, Erin, and as you all have stated, right, federal resources, funding, it's been cut back. And so in this climate of scarcity and federal retreat, where do you see some of the greatest opportunities for your three organizations to share resources or data to fill some of these gaps? I know you referenced some of these in some earlier questions, but I'd just love for you to expand on that just a bit more.
I mean, one thing that we are all doing together is we are kind of the core of the steering committee of Growing Together Connecticut, which is a sort of coalition of organizations really dedicated to redressing the history of housing segregation and in a variety of forms, whether that be barriers that were erected or just basic affordable housing issues, that the kind that Greg was discussing. So, by coming together and advocating together, we can make a big difference. So that's one part of the answer.
Hmm. Anyone else like to respond to more of that question? Love to hear from you, Michelle, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the affordable housing piece, I don't think it doesn't naturally seem, or one wouldn't naturally think that it flows into what the work that the commission does. But a big piece, I'll say the quiet part out loud of affordable housing and its resistance to it is discrimination and
Hmm.
the belief of who lives in affordable housing. And so that piece of it is important because who lives in affordable housing Teachers live in affordable housing, and people who work at your town hall live in affordable housing. And in a state like Connecticut, there's lots of folks. I know when I was a staff attorney at the Fair Housing Center back in the start of my career, I could have lived in affordable housing. It's a long time ago, Greg. But it was when you work at a nonprofit. I mean, even though I was an attorney, I wasn't, like living large on my, nonprofit attorney money there. So I think that piece of it and what we can do at the commission, we can bring commission initiated complaints. So while most of the vast bulk of the complaints that come through the agency are individuals who file discrimination complaints with us, we also, as an agency and through statute, have the ability to file commission initiated complaints when we see discriminatory events happening. And so, through the affordable housing piece of it, there is that piece of the discrimination that, we can and will and want to fill in the void. They're complicated cases, but they're valuable cases. And again, it's so much better to get people to just build affordable housing, but sometimes a little litigation, smooths it along the track. So I think those, in those ways, as the enforcement agency for the state, we recognize that there are pieces of it that overlap into the work that we do, even though we're not in the piece that Aaron occupies.
Yeah, and I'd just say, sort of building off that there are just many aspects and pieces to segregation that persists in Connecticut. And so, yeah, we're all looking at it from different angles and from different people who are experiencing it and trying to address it any way that we can. In terms of, any changes or any intentionality going forward, coordinating on any changes to state law or state regulation, I think are going to be important in the coming years. We don't know what else is going to happen at the federal level. As I mentioned before, our courts look to the federal courts for guidance on how to implement our state fair housing law. And something weird or terrible could happen at that level. And so we may need to address it in Connecticut so that, Connecticut values are reflected rather than really out there negative values that might happen at the federal level. I do think that this has not been an area of coordination, but has, I feel, sort of organically happened. We each produce reports, some more than others, and I feel like we are generally guided on producing reports or doing research on areas that haven't really been touched on recently or that need to be investigated. And we're all aware of what the others are doing, and so we tend not to duplicate those efforts. So I think we get a broader range of coverage on issues because we, know that we have other healthy organizations who are tackling things, and we don't have to redo work that's already being done. So we might spend a lot more of our resources on looking at the intersection of eviction and race and other protected class status, while OCA is doing a lot of work around zoning. And Michelle, I remember you guys put out a report a year or two ago, and I'm totally blanking on what it was, but I remember when it came out. And
yeah, I mean,
zoning.
it was a zoning, yeah, it was a zoning
yeah,
report.
Yeah, it was
That's
very
right.
good.
And so
yeah,
we all
and we
have
do
our
just as an
contributions.
agency. That's true.
Oh, great. All right. So thank you for just sort of sharing again, the important pieces that you're all working on in terms of moving us forward, at the state level, certainly. And so I have one final question, and it's a bit of an open-ended question, and I open it up for all of you to respond. But here it is. So the title of this panel mentions the soul of fair housing. Beyond the courtroom wins and the policy papers, there is a moral engine that drives the CHRO, the center, and OCA. How would you describe that engine? And how does it keep you moving forward when the national landscape feels so stagnant? Question is a bit meta, but I'd love to hear from
Heard it. I mean, okay, so I have the benefit of the agency that I work at in that I've always done a lot of housing because that's my background, but we enforce all of the discrimination statutes. So the bulk of the work that we do is in employment discrimination, we do public accommodation discrimination, and housing. And so having worked in all of it and seeing who the players are in terms of the parties who come in, housing is just always has that special place in my heart. And the soul of it is that it gets right down to that person, the person who deserves to have a safe place to live in, because that safe place to live in is the way they go to school. It's how they get to their doctor. It's how they go to work. It's how they are all the things that everyone believes or thinks is what makes all of us, work interchangeably in this community. And that's what makes the housing cases ever so more desperate and more complicated in some ways, because we're talking about people so much more than work, and we're talking about employment discrimination cases. Things happen and they're bad, but you don't, there's sometimes we all feel this way, I'm sure. You don't live there necessarily. Sometimes I feel that way. But in your house, you live there. And if that's not safe and if that isn't so profound for people, that this place that we live in has to be protected. And it has to be protected irrespective of what's happening at the federal level, because it is the basis for which all things bloom out of how we function, how our relationships work. It is that important. And I think that um, for me, it's always been that way personally. But what I try to impart on the folks that I work with is the importance of that, and that the shifting landscape really can't discourage the importance of that, because that is the nucleus of everything that comes around it. It's the nucleus to your employment. It's the nucleus to your public accommodation. It's the nucleus to your school. It's the nucleus to everything. And so I think that we have to really always, for me, I always stay centered on that. And once you do that, then you'll do what it takes to make sure that all of the other pieces are protected and fall into place by the work that we do through education, outreach, legislation, all of the things that we do, because that piece of it is so important.
Thank you. Wonderful. Aaron, Greg? Yeah. Aaron?
I'll just add to that. I mean, the things that has brought me to this work, and I think really undergirds how we move forward in it, is this notion of choice, the ability to choose where one lives. And, that connects back to a lot of things Michelle was just talking about. And we have this goal that families and individuals should be able to choose to live in a neighborhood where, particularly their kids will be able to thrive. And that means both that there has to be the ability to have the choice, but also that we need to work towards a day when all communities are communities where kids can thrive. And these are the two pieces of the work coming out of the fair housing movement that we need to focus on. And we have seen lots of different strategies that can help us get there, and we just need to put them into practice.
Wonderful. Thank you. Greg, did you want to share your meta perspective as well?
Yeah, I think this question is, a challenging one to ask or to answer organizationally as opposed to personally, because it is a little bit of a different career path than, I don't know, being no offense to car salespersons and being a car salesperson. This is more of a calling, I think, than just an occupation. I think for me personally, I grew up in Connecticut. I grew up in Hartford. I experienced and saw white flight from the city as, a departer. You can't tell me that what I look like and who I am didn't have an influence on my life and the life choices I got. And you can't tell me that the same isn't true for someone who happened to have darker skin than I, happened to be black, happened to be another race, happened to be another sex. So it's really important to me to share that message and to say, at least some people like me understand that and want to be allies and want to do the work that Aaron just described as being so important, because housing, as Michelle described, is so foundational to everything. When it gets down to it, and one of the things that frustrates me so much about this work and about the pushback against civil rights is that basically all comes down to the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Be kind. Don't try to manipulate people. Don't try to exploit people. And why is that controversial? Um, it's hard to kind of grasp, but that's what it all boils down to in the end. And it's sad that, we have to have organizations um, under-resourced for the job, trying to fight to ensure that people can experience some kindness in their day-to-day lives and in these important moments in their life, doing these other things that Michelle talked about. So that's, sort of I guess the meta response to that. I think the more um, legalistic response is also one of frustration, but the Connecticut Constitution has enshrined the right to be free from segregation as a fundamental right in Connecticut. That constitutional provision doesn't have a lot of teeth and hasn't gotten a lot of traction since it was, passed, 60-ish years ago when we revised our Constitution. But that should be a guiding principle for everything that happens in this state. And we haven't gotten there, and we need to, as I said, civil rights is more than just, Nadia, I'm not going to rent to you, I'm going to rent to Aaron. It's about larger systems of exclusion and exploitation and things that we sort of let slide because they're hidden under um, a screen of, oh, it's just economics, it's just business, it's just capitalism. There are components to it, and we need to consider ourselves bound, and we need to aspire to, what our Constitution says. And, as I said, the golden rule is what it boils down to. So yeah, I think that's what guides my interest in the work, and I think what guides most of the folks at the center is that we want to stand up for folks. We want to enforce not only civil rights, but what really gets to a more civil society. We need people to be more civil and more kind and more thoughtful.
Thank you so much. I think there's just such a wonderful way to close the panelist portion of this program. So thank you. I just wanted to do a quick clap for you all. That was my final question for you all. But I will say that we have probably a very brief Q&A portion, and it seems that there's one question for the moderator, which is me. Um, and so, but I will say this, I'll ask the question, but then I invite you all to respond because you are far more client facing than I in regards to this question, but I will share a couple thoughts. So this question says, Professor Humber, your research, how technology can bridge or widen the equity gap. How are AI-driven tenant screening algorithms currently impacting fair housing in Connecticut? And do our current state laws account for algorithmic bias? Now, I will say I have my perspective as the researcher, and again, I really do invite, especially, Greg, who I know worked on the core logic case on this issue, to definitely speak to this. But from my perspective, um, I do think that AI tenant screening tools are absolutely affecting individuals' home search processes. I think it creates challenges. I think those challenges are, there's always been challenges, I think, right? As we know, when it comes to looking for homes and being excluded for, who you are, and these protected categories. But those protected categories and all of the sort of the systems and the structural racism, what have you, that are embedded within the data that's used to operate these systems, I think exacerbates that issue and increases all of those problems at scale. And so I don't know if our laws are currently equipped in Connecticut to deal with these issues, aside from the remedy of disparate impact, which, from my understanding, is that it's practically speaking a difficult remedy for, the everyday person to be able to take advantage of. And so, fortunately, we have organizations, right, like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center and the other two organizations here to help address some of those claims that can be made on behalf of individuals, but I think it's definitely a resource challenge. But I do see that, yes, AI tenant screening tools are impacting fair housing to a pretty significant extent, outside of Connecticut, certainly as well. Do any of you have thoughts on this for this questioner?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say in theory, could AI make things better? Yes, in theory it could, but it's all about the choices that people make in deploying it and training it. So in practice, it seems to me to generally make things worse. I think one of the fundamental problems with it is people who rely on automated algorithmic tenant screening don't question it. They accept the answer that they get from the algorithm and then just throw up their hands like it's out of our control. Well, no, it actually isn't. You still are the human being making the decision at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of issues of embedding discriminatory beliefs into the algorithms and then just mistakes. I mean, algorithms make mistakes. AI hallucinate. Names get mixed up. You know, there's a lot of people in this country and a lot of people who share names. And so if you get a hit back that someone has an eviction record, well, you should probably make sure that it's actually the person that you're talking to, or that you're considering. So yeah, lots and lots of concerns about algorithmic and AI-based screening, and not a lot of confidence that the industry itself is going to do better. I think we do need stronger state laws on the issue. One of the other things is that these algorithms may not be state specific. And so they may, lawfully include some screening criteria that's permitted under the Federal Fair Housing Act or in another state, but may not work in Connecticut. I'm thinking specifically of source of income protections and screening tools that look at income that don't take into account the impact that having a subsidy might have on that qualification. So yeah, theoretical promise, but practically a significant net negative so far.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, I believe that is our one Q&A question. So with that, thank you again for the person who submitted the question for our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Rashida to close the program.
Thank you all so much. I would say give a round of applause, but it's a webinar, so you could hit that clap reaction. Thank you guys, snap reaction. As we conclude today, it's clear that with the federal government, while the federal government may be rolling back protections, Connecticut is drawing a line in the sand. We've heard from Michelle, Greg, and Aaron that our state statutes aren't just policies, that there are tools that we must use to build our own roadmap for equity. The soul of fair housing doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives in our local zoning boards, our courtrooms, and our community advocacy. I encourage everyone here to take the insights shared today and turn them into engagement. One way that you can do that is by supporting the work of the CHRO, of the center, and of OCA. Let's ensure that this promise of equal access for all in Connecticut becomes a reality for every resident. Thank you to our brilliant panelists for their leadership and to our excellent moderator. Thank you for being a part of this vital conversation. Please stay connected with these organizations by following them on social media, seeing the excellent work that they're doing, and look out for other links for other upcoming events. And lastly, happy Fair Housing Month and have a good evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.